So they're both going to give us short talks tonight. And first, please welcome Rebecca Aloisio.
I'm a little shorter, yeah. Thank you so much to John and Rebecca and everybody that helped with the installation and inviting me to come and show here. This is a really exciting opportunity for me. So the presentation that I put together tonight really is a way of looking at my practice from a lot of different perspectives. I've been a practicing artist for a long time, but the work that I'm currently doing is relatively new. So these are always good reasons for me to kind of get my ideas together and be able to kind of look at what it is that I'm thinking about. So I'm going to start with this slide. So my background is actually in sculpture. This is back in 2000. That's me on the right, and that's my friend Will on the left, the one-size-fits-all suits. So we had a foundry there. So I went to the Cleveland Institute of Art, and what really drew me into sculpture was the materiality and working with my hands. And I didn't even know what I was doing half the time. I just loved, fire. This is the foundry. And what I really found interesting of all the things that I did, casting in particular, and lost wax casting, which, for those of you that have done it, you carve or you create something in wax, and then you create a mold around it, and then you burn that out, and then you've got this this object translated into bronze or whatever metal. And it was a really exciting process. And it wasn't about multiples. It was actually just about taking something non-precious like wax and kind of converting it into something like bronze. There we go. So that's not a great image, and I apologize. So this was actually on a slide years ago. So I did a lot of figurative work in this way. So those were all individual little figures, that I had carved and then turned into bronze. We have an excellent glass program there too. So working with glass and casting glass, and it was just so fascinating to me, that whole process. And I continued with that. So leaving undergrad. You'll never find a job description that says, sculpture or sculptor wanted, so you're kind of always looking for opportunities in whatever ways you can. And so I did a lot of different jobs. I took a lot of time off between my undergraduate and my graduate degree. And so I spent some time at the Smithsonian working in their exhibits department, again, doing casting, but in a very different way. And I also did painting for them too. But what was fascinating to me here in this context was that you were using molds to actually preserve or archive objects. So they had casts, whole rooms just dedicated to fossils, or plants that no longer existed. So it was a whole different relationship to the process. And the molds themselves I just loved. I thought they were beautiful. I learned all different ways of making molds. And I also did a lot of painting there as well. An artist that really influences my work and has for a long time is Rachel Whiteread. And she, is looking at, she does casting as well, but she's looking at the space that is intangible. So those on the left are the inside of chairs that she built molds around and cast in resin. The piece on the right is a cast of the water towers in New York. And I just thought that was fascinating, kind of taking nothing and creating the object from the absence. I also did a lot of work as a scenic painter. I worked at Studio Arena here years ago before it closed, and that was where I got my training. And that use of material was really influential. Learning to take something like foam or wood and just treat the surface so that it would translate into something totally different. So like marble, making marble out of foam. It was bizarre. And also there was this non-precious quality to this. So you'd spend all these hours working on these things, and then you'd see them in the dumpster the day after the show was over. So, that was kind of bizarre and interesting. And then being around the theater, even though there is a distinction between the performing and then the behind the scenes, I did get some influence there as well. And kind of this is actually my uncle, but the Michael Chekhov technique is one that's really unique. That I don't really know that well, but I'm slightly familiar with it. But it deals with the body and the physicality of the body, thinking about imagination and using visuals to evoke feelings not through memory, but through touch. So what he explained to me was that, if you had to do a scene, and I'm not an actor whatsoever, but where you were in a scene with another person that you hated, or that the relationship was tense, instead of projecting a memory to try to create that emotion, you would imagine something physical between you. So a rusty hook in your mouth taught to theirs. Already, I'm not an actor, but I could imagine like being really irritated at that person, very easily. And so that was really interesting, the use of the physical body and the memory, to create an authentic experience. Okay, so this slide, kind of jumping a bit, but drawing is also a big part of my practice. It's probably the thing that I've done the longest and the thing that I've dedicated myself to the longest. I could draw anything anywhere and be totally content. And I currently teach this now at RIT, so it's funny. But this is I love this diagram. It's out of a book. It's called the Science and Practice of Drawing by Harold Speed. And he breaks drawing down into these two categories. The one on the left, the B, is what he wants students to do, and that is to draw what they see, not what they know. Those of you that have taken a drawing class, probably, or observational drawing class, have probably heard that, and I preach it to my students often. But it's learning to convey what it is you're looking at directly, as opposed to what you think you see, and that is A. And he's very snarky in the book. He thinks we're all really dumb because we automatically draw like A from the beginning. But he talks about touch again as being that reason. So we draw the face as a circle when we're young because our heads are circles. We understand that. Hair is a line, and so we illustrate it as a line because that's how we relate to our hair as an individual line. And the teeth, are squares, so we draw squares. So it's a way of automatically taking a three-dimensional thing and flattening it, plotting it, understanding it in a really different way. And I think this is kind of like a branch off for me. It's the way that I started to deal with drawing was more towards A after so many years. And I like this as kind of an illustration, it's sort of jumping off of that previous slide. The Nazca Plains in Peru, these giant drawings in the desert. Robert Morris went there and wrote this beautiful short collection of just thoughts that he had about the space, but that these drawings were so unique these images, because they could easily convert from a two-dimensional thing to a spatial three-dimensional thing, depending on your point of view. So, if you were down on the ground, what you would see is just the line itself, and you'd be in the desert. It'd be very physical, very tactile, almost very three-dimensional. And yet to see the images in their entirety as this illustration of, I think that's the bird there, you'd have to be in an airplane to see it, or up on a mountain. So that started to really interest me, this idea of scale, changing the way that we respond to an image. My slides are a little out of order, actually, but I'm going to spend a second just talking about my relationship to technology, because it's a big part of my process. So here I've got just a bunch of images of slide film, and I was born in that time, that small between the 70s and the early 80s, where we touched everything. I started off with having a black and white television, and then, by the time I graduated, Facebook existed. It was a lot of change in a very short amount of time. But this idea about documenting sculpture was a big conversation that I had as a student in particular. Not very many people actually saw the objects that you made. They saw the image of the object. And trying to take slide film, those of you that have done it, it's a pain in the... It's so hard. I didn't do very well at it. You're always trying to bracket and get everything just perfect. And I remember the day that I touched a digital camera, and I was like, oh my God, I can actually delete this. But ironically, the slides that I did take that survived, and I have hundreds of them that were really terrible, are much more accurate and crisp compared to some of my earliest digital images, because they were on a zip drive, that doesn't even exist anymore. So it's those are gone, but I still have my slide film. So, this idea of analog technology being more precious than what I'm dealing with even now. So yeah, this is just a quick collection of things. All these things I had as a child. I mean, these were not it wasn't about nostalgia. I had a black and white TV, that was the phone. I had an Atari, I had a record player, and I applied for college on that typewriter, but I was researching college on the internet. My brother, who's only 3 years younger than me, never touched the typewriter. He went right to Microsoft. So then, thinking about images, my relationship to images, and in terms of the synthetic space that is the internet, and the fact that we can take so many now in our hands. Everybody's a photographer, you hear that all the time. I Googled really quickly selfies of babies, and I have a 3-year-old now, but I remember talking to friends, and they were saying after the first 6 months of their kid's life, they had 12,000 photos of them, and I was like, oh my God, what are we gonna do with all of it? What happens to this? I don't know, this is more of a question than anything, but I remember, I have 12 images of my entire childhood, you know what I mean? It's bizarre. So that's me actually going now to it. That was me in kindergarten. And 88, so that was on Kodak film, and it took forever to develop, and this is what my parents have. This is the image that they like. This is what they have of me. But the reality of that experience was that. So that was me, that was the first take, right? That summed up kindergarten, man. That was, me, I was totally devastated. And my mom was, she was like, this is unacceptable, we can't have this. Because it was precious, this photo meant something. So 6 months later, she made me go back and do that. And I was coached, and she dressed me the same. And these were it was so weird. Okay, anyway, so it got me thinking about this idea, with images and with how we distribute them and how quickly we have access to them just in our hands, this idea of simulating an experience and the difference between faking it or posing and actually simulating it. This is a really dense book, and I've had it in my studio for a long time, but this one quote I think kind of touches on some of these ideas. And he writes, "Whoever fakes an illness can simply stay in bed and make everyone believe he is ill, but whoever simulates an illness produces himself some of the symptoms." So this question of, when does the simulation become the truth or the reality? So now just kind of looking at my own work, and some of these, not all of those ideas come into every piece, but they're always kind of floating around in my head. So these are some early drawings that I did when I went back to grad school, and I was working with graphite on Mylar, and I was just interested in creating this surface that was really, again, tactile, all about the material. I was layering graphite up, trying to create a very three-dimensional image that was flat. And when I went to photograph it, it was a disaster. It doesn't look like that in real life. It was reflecting the light. And then when I tried to get it professionally photographed, and they had the, all the diffusers and everything, it was totally black. I couldn't see anything. And it was really troublesome. And I continued to do them, and then I actually started to get really excited about the image, that the image was more interesting than the drawings. And the drawings themselves were really not anything that I could preserve, because the layer of graphite on the surface was so dense that I couldn't spray it, I couldn't protect it, they were fragile. But the image was really exciting. So I started to work with that, and it became its own thing. It wasn't really documentation anymore, because it wasn't what they looked like in life, but they were really interesting. So I continued looking at this, and so this is a series that I did where you'll see the drawing is, well, they kind of alternate, but one is the drawing and the other is the image of the drawing based on the lighting. And I started to work with collage and cut elements, and thinking about kind of layers in the work. And then I saw this piece at the Whitney in 2013, maybe it was, but it's Wade Guidance piece. And he works a lot with just the printers. Printers are his medium. And so these are giant paintings that he just ran through printers, and it's in person, it's amazing. You see where the printer fails, where the print heads get clogged, or the alignment changes, or the paper rips, or the canvas buckles. And I just was like, oh my God, the printer is a paintbrush. It just all opened up. So I started playing around with, continuing to run things. I don't use programs. There's no Photoshop or anything in this. It's all physical. But I run things through the printer. I put it through the scanner. I'll use a camera when I have access to nice ones. I was doing screen printing on these, painting on these. So these are smaller. And then, another artist that influences that influences my work a lot is Katharina Gross. And her use, it's different, but she's taking color, and she's using color, and she's spraying it on these forms, these three-dimensional spaces, and they start to become flat, and it's really beautiful work. I just really like how she handles dealing with three-dimensional forms and color. And then this is Katharina Fritsch. So she's actually taking she's taking these objects, playing with their scale, adding color, just doing some really interesting things. And so, along with I have my own collection of objects. So all of the things that I work with in my pieces are all found. Nothing is created by me alone. So I collect things. These are medical supplies, and I'll cast them, I'll photograph them, I'll scan them, I do a lot of casting still. So like I'll take the insides of cups or things that are ubiquitous that everybody probably has handled and discards. It's just anything I can find. I did have somebody once ask me if my work was about trash, and it's not. Oh, this is a grill I found in the bushes. I love it. I don't know how I'm gonna use it, if ever, but like amazing. That's like the most amazing cast I've ever handled. So I just continuing with the layering. This with pieces, all of the individual compositions are like 9 by 12, give or take. And then I started to use tape really directly, and the tape kind of became an element that interested me. Especially, I guess it's about, using materials and techniques that everybody can identify. So the idea of taping, stapling, gluing, cutting, ripping, when you see that, whether it's on the physical collage or on the print, you understand what that mark is and how to do it. It's not about, the techniques are really low budget. So then, these collages they were getting more intricate and more fragile, and I started to take images of them and run them through printers. And the biggest that I can get right now is 60 inches, because that's as large as you can go. But so these are some of this is like pieces I did just out of grad school. So this was in 2015, 2014. So these are about 7 feet tall, and the larger they get, the more excited I get about them, but it's really expensive, and it pisses off my family because it's nowhere to store it. But so the surfaces themselves, so if you were to see this, it's totally flat, but the surface has screen printed areas that will be glossy, or the finish. I experiment with the finish here. So there's a couple of them. So there's another one. That one's another one. That one is the most three-dimensional. When people see it in person, they think they can touch it. That's something that really interests me too. It was when you're in front of these things, can you touch them? I want it to go back to be, I'm flattening these things, and then they're coming back, to this physical space, or alluding to that. Another one. And then this was printed on canvas, so I've been, testing printing on papers, printing on canvases. There is a big difference between the two. Certainly, the look of fiber, I didn't think about it, but the fiber of the canvas actually doesn't work as well as the paper, because the materials that I'm working with are paper. So there's another one on canvas. Another one. And then also playing with different types of paints on the surface that, interfere with light. And then this piece was done on a paper that's metallic, so I'm still experimenting with the types of surfaces that I want to print on. I usually, the areas or the centers that I use to print at get stressed out with me, because I'll be bringing in stuff that's not appropriate for their printers, but they work with me, it's okay. And just lately, I've started to look at maybe more figurative. So the work upstairs actually is the most figurative I've gotten in a while. There's another one. Or suggesting the body or suggesting a narrative. And that's just a shot of my studio. So the collages, they only exist for so long, and then they recycle through. So, people will ask me, what's really the piece? Is it the collage or the print or the big version? And for me, it's always the big version. But I guess you could argue either way. So anyway, that's what I have. So thank you.